felt about you. So these are just some of the things that your colleagues have said about you. She is thoughtful, demanding, meticulous and tireless, and a critical figure at the highest level of journalism. She's hands down the most impressive, engaged editor I've ever worked with. Her editing is architectural, and she is part editor, part journalist, part shrink, a sympathetic figure, but then also a deadline enforcer. So how would you describe the job that you do?
Oh. You know, as an editor, you're required to be a cheerleader for deep reporting, for taking on tough assignments, being a backseat driver, sometimes saying, let's go in this direction, let's go in that direction, let's go faster, let's go slower sometimes. You have to be the toughest critic of the story, meaning identifying the problems, the holes that remain, how much more needs to be done, and looking at it with a cold eye and saying sometimes there's not enough here, we can't do this. And also an advocate for the story. And wanting it to be the best story it can be, the most ambitious story it can be, and the most best written story it can be, which can require a lot of revising. And, you know, as an editor, you have to accept your fate of living vicariously through your reporters. And I find the whole process of, you know, identifying stories and deciding which targets are, you know, most promising to pursue, and you know, getting in the trenches with reporters on the chase, but then, you know, being very hard-headed about, you know, what we need to make this story work. It's a joyous experience.
Well, you've said that the scariest thing about stories is what is not in them, but should be. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that sometimes, and it leads in a way to journalism's worst mistakes, when someone is reporting a story and they have a lot of the facts right, but they add 2 and 2 and get 5. That there are other explanations for a conclusion that they hadn't considered, that there are possibly all sorts of contexts that they didn't report, and that would completely change the premise of the story. And, you know, that happens at times, and you don't see that. It's not like you're just looking at this paragraph and, you know, fixing the words. It's you have to imagine as an editor what you should be asking and what you should be looking at elsewhere. And many reporters are great at that, but sometimes with some stories, you know, they've forgotten to ask, you know, a very basic but, you know, pivotal question.
So what about the therapeutic part, the shrink part of being an editor? I've heard that you've got a couch in your office. Do you actually have that?
That was my old office. I don't have one now. Look, it helps as an editor, I think, to be a low-maintenance personality because you're often working with some high-maintenance personalities. And I see some people here recognize themselves. And that, I mean, firstly, you're dealing with people, and they have lives, and they're all different, and they all respond to different sorts of, you know, care and handling. And that, you know, sometimes you just have to listen a lot. Sometimes you have to prod a bit. I had one reporter who I've worked with for many, many years, and that often there would be, you know, little mini explosions about a story, and then inevitably I would get the apology bottle of wine and everything was great, you know, in 6 hours, and it was just a little ritual, and we both understood it.
Sounds like many of my relationships.
These are long-term relationships often.
Yeah.
So.
So we have to talk about the Weinstein story because it's this like iconic photo of you at the office at the New York Times, and there's you, and then there's the two reporters, Jodie Cantor and Megan Twohey. There's Dean Baquet, Baquet, and Matthew Purdy,
Right.
and you're like hunched over the computer screen, and this is
Right.
2017, the 5th of October, and you're
Right.
just about to
Right.
publish the first article.
Right.
So what went through your head at that moment?
Well, that photo was probably taken a few minutes before we published, and there had been a lot going on the previous few days where we had been dealing with Weinstein and his rather large cast of lawyers and advisors and publicists. And so there had been a lot of back and forth and discussions. We had a deadline, I think it was 1 o'clock that day. And a few minutes before deadline, we still hadn't gotten any response. So one of the reporters called up someone on his team, and he got on the phone and was saying, it's coming, but then he was trying to ask more questions about the story. And then suddenly there was this flood of emails, and all of his different advisors had different ideas of how he should respond. So there was one response that said that he was raised in a different generation and was learning that, he had said maybe some things that were offensive, but he was, on a re-education effort, and maybe he would go on a retreat somewhere. Another one was from the lawyer that threatened to sue us that he had hired. And he said he's acknowledging no wrongdoing of any sort, anytime, anywhere, any place. Another one said that he was going to go work against the National Rifle Association, which really had no bearing on any of this. And most famously, he cited some Jay-Z lyric, except he got the lyric wrong. So that created a whole social media thing. So at any rate, so just before that photo, we were like speed reading through all these emails, and I was leaning over the copy editor, sort of saying, let's use this paragraph here and then make this reference there. And then we were all giving it a last look, and then we hit the publish button. And I'd like to say there was relief, but that lasted a very short time because, firstly, then Weinstein called an hour later and spoke to the two reporters and me and was complaining about various things in the story, and then was announced that he was going to sue us. And then we were on to the second story that ran 5 days later.
But I mean, he's a really powerful man, and there had been rumors about him for several years, and people had tried to pursue this story, but they hadn't made it. So was there a point when you worked on this, when you thought that this will never work?
No, I actually didn't think that. The story started after discussions at the paper. We had just published the Bill O'Reilly story, the Fox News star that had, we reported that had reached settlements with 5 women for millions and millions of dollars. So we started asking, are there other men in other industries with similar histories? And so Weinstein's name came up in that discussion because Jodie and some others were aware of the rumors about Weinstein, but we weren't sure if there was a there. But after a few weeks of reporting, even though she didn't have any firsthand account of any episode with Weinstein, she was getting enough hints from people who would say things like, I really can't talk about that, or you should talk to someone else. And so it seemed as if there was a there. And then after several months, she and Megan, who then joined a little later, began to get real traction. And I think the question was, how long would it take, as opposed to, is there going to be a story here? But it was a huge slog because we had to find documentation, we had to find witnesses, and we had to persuade women to talk on the record, which was a huge challenge.
Yeah. Well, I read somewhere that when Harvey Weinstein heard that you were reporting about this, that he said, the story sounds so good, I want to buy the movie rights. But he reacted really violently, right? He even hired like an ex-Mossad agent.
Well, he learned that we were reporting the story about 2 months into our reporting, and he was very eager to talk to us. And his, entourage of fancy lawyers and publicists, various ones called us and wanted to speak to us, and they called the publisher, they called the executive editor, they called our lawyer, and in every case they were told, you have to deal with the reporters and their editor, and you have to speak on the record. And that was not what he wanted to do.
Because you only let him speak on the record, right?
Yes, he was the focus of a serious investigation. There's no use to us of information that's off the record. He had had a history of dealing with private intelligence agencies over the years when he wanted to sort of smear rivals in the tabloid magazines and elsewhere. And he used them for when he had problems with some business deals. So not only did he use some long-standing firms, but he did end up hiring this Israeli firm, Black Cube, which had former Israeli intelligence and military agents on its staff. And we later learned, we did not know this in real time, that one of them approached Jodi and sent her an email, and she was posing as, I forget exactly what it was, but the idea was to talk to Jodi and then try to find out what she was reporting and who she was talking to. And various other Black Cube employees reached out to Ronan Farrow, reached out to a New York Magazine reporter who had been trying to report the story but had given up, and reached out to actresses that Harvey figured might be talking about him. And in different circumstances, they posed as different types of people. And in addition, Weinstein sent former employees to talk to women, again, who he feared might be talking to us or who might have had settlements, and had these women reach out to them and remind them of their non-disclosure agreements.
Yeah. Well, Harvey Weinstein was also one of your greatest advertisers, right? So how did you handle
Well,
that?
I would not say he was one of the biggest, but he had been over the years. He had not been advertising with us for a year or so. I mean, it was very episodic. It depended when he had movies. And he was a little behind on his bills.
Well, the Me Too movement, the spark for the global Me Too movement, do you think that it came from your office at the New York Times, or do you think that it came from social media? Where do you think?
I think that it was a whole combination of things. I mean, I think that the combination in the United States of the Bill Cosby trial 2 years ago that ended in a mistrial, the allegations against Trump that during the campaign that he sort of, whacked away and, made defamatory comments about the accusers. Then the Bill O'Reilly case, I think, sent a really important message to corporations that your biggest asset could become a liability. Advertisers revolted. And we reported about Silicon Valley and problems there. So when the Weinstein thing happened, I think it sort of built on this feeling like there's some real problems here and some real cultural issues in various industries. And the Me Too movement, I think, definitely was given new momentum by the Weinstein thing. And they're very different things. Journalism is very different from the Me Too movement, and they abide by very different, standards and rules. But I think that the Weinstein story gave it new energy, but I think the bottom line was women were fed up, that so much of what happened to women in the stories we reported about resonated with ordinary women all over the world.
Well, one reporter has said of you, she just has an incredibly great backbone when it comes to what you need to do to pursue a story, and no one intimidates her. Is that true?
Well, I'm sure there's somebody, but we have a really good lawyer, and we never lost a libel suit. And Harvey Weinstein you know, didn't seem like that big of a threat compared to some other people. And he was a public figure, and sort of the law is with us. Many years ago, I worked on the NSA warrantless wiretapping story. And that was a story that the President of the United States told the publisher of the New York Times that we would have our blood on our hands if we published. And we published that story. And I think there's Harvey Weinstein, there's the President of the United States. It was a different President of the United States, mind you, too.
But I mean, you do report about, I mean, very powerful men, very powerful companies, and sometimes very powerful countries. And they constantly want to kill your stories. So how do you cope with that?
Well,
how do you protect yourselves?
I mean, I think that we try to bulletproof stories, and there is you know, it's our job as an editor. We're the net. We have to catch reporters so they don't fall. And that means, you know, being intimately aware of what we're reporting, of challenging the premises of the story, of questioning, you know, every element of it to just make sure that we've gone through the exercise of feeling very solid about what we publish. And we vet stories with our lawyer, and that, you know, we don't have a history of backing off, and, you know, it's very institutional.
Yeah. Well, I mean, free press is under attack. We know that maybe now more than ever. I'm just Jim Acosta at CNN, like the latest news.
Right.
Sometimes I think it's like living in a really, really bad superhero movie where the villains have, you know, no other character traits than evil. But Dean Baquet, the executive editor of New York Times, he said that, I mean, Trump is a powerful enemy, but on one hand, he's bad for you. His attacks are bad for you. But on the other hand, I haven't seen journalism this energized for a very long time. So do you agree? Do you feel the same?
I mean, Trump is a great story, and he makes a lot of news. There has never been a presidency like this. In terms of the pace of news, I mean, in previous administrations, there might be one big story a week or maybe two. This is 5 stories a day because, as you know, he's a very effective communicator. And so, you know, with 5 tweets, he can set off 5 different storylines. And while you're still doing reporting on the previous, you know, day's storylines, but he's also challenged the very institutions of government. I mean, he went after the Supreme Court justice yesterday, and, you know, he fights with his own party in Congress, and he's trying to upend, you know, long-standing policy and practices, and journalistically, it's a very important, challenging, and vital, you know, mission to cover all of that. And yes, he does attack us. And it's, you know, it's one thing when he talks about the failing New York Times, and we're actually doing okay. But it's another thing when he talks about the press as the enemy of the people, because that can create a very dangerous climate. And that is of real concern. And our publisher spoke to him about it in the Oval Office, you know, 3 or 4 months ago.
So what do you think will happen?
I am not in the business of prediction, and, you know, many...
Spoken like a true editor.
This is an unpredictable presidency and an unpredictable climate in our country. So it's just really hard to know what will happen next.
Well, speaking to you and being in this room with all you people, I have great hopes for journalism. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure talking
Bye-bye.
to you. Rebecca Corbett.